Okay, wonderful. Well, I'm going to get started and we will continue to let people join us, of course, as they come onto the call. I just want to welcome everyone and say whoever you are and wherever you're tuning in from, we're very glad you're here with us right now. And I'm very excited about this conversation. We'll also be recording this call, and so people who were not able to join us live will be able to view the conversation, and hopefully it will spark dialogue in their environment as well. So by way of introduction, thank you for joining us for this online forum. I'm Christa Tinari, and I'm the Director of Contemplative-Based Resilience Project at the Garrison Institute. And the CBR project is designed to help those who serve others be well so they can serve well. And the Garrison Institute's mission is to apply the transformative power of contemplative practices to help address today's pressing social and environmental concerns, resulting in a more compassionate and resilient future. So before we begin, I have a few requests and reminders to those of you tuning in live. We have muted the sound for everyone but the speakers in order to minimize the background noise. However, we're excited that you're here and we welcome your participation in the chat box. So please feel free to type comments, thoughts, resources, and your questions there. And my colleague, Elizabeth Preisinger, is also on the call with us today and will be managing chat. And would be glad to raise your questions up so we can answer as many of those as possible by the end of the hour. We're recording this forum, and the recording will be posted to the Garrison Institute website and YouTube channel within a week's time. Please visit garrisoninstitute.org to access the recordings and to view a schedule of our upcoming programs. So without further ado, I'm very, very pleased to welcome Anu Gupta, an educator, lawyer, scientist, and founder and CEO of Be More with Anu. These are some labels Anu, right? We'll address that in our talk. And Be More with Anu is an organization that trains professionals across corporate, nonprofit, and government sectors to advance DEIB and wellness by breaking bias. His work has reached 300 plus organizations, and he's trained more than 80,000 professionals, impacting over 30 million lives. He's a peer-reviewed author, written and spoken extensively, including on the TED stage and Oprah conversations. And in addition to these personal appearances, I also know that he maintains a practice as a contemplative practitioner quite seriously, which clearly informs his personal and professional work. So I was very delighted to have received an advance copy of Breaking Bias and read it cover to end. I have definitely benefited from it, feel enriched by the information, the wisdom, and the compassion that really came forward in the book. So thank you personally, Anu, for that. And it so clearly explains how an embodied contemplative practice provides us with a meaningful way to understand, approach, and challenge inequity, and to move away from the dominator and the exclusion paradigms, which we've all absorbed and learned within our thinking and society, and to instead move toward inclusion, belonging, and the sacred interconnectedness that defines our existence with each other on this planet. So I'm again excited to dive into the conversation today, and just to say we'll have about a 50-minute conversation. We're going to leave some time for additional Q&A at the end, and we'll be closing the call right at an hour and 15 minutes. So welcome, Anu. I want to give the floor to you and invite you to be with us and get us started with the practice.
Well, thank you so much for having me, the Garrison Institute. Thank you, Christa and Elizabeth, as well, and to all of you who've joined. So, Breaking Bias comes out in a week, and this is one of my first events. So, it's really exciting to be here with you all and to spend this time with you, particularly if you're in the US. Tonight's a big night for anyone who's following, you know, political aspects of what's happening in our world. And so I think this conversation hopefully will invigorate you and inspire you to, take action, but also to be able to manage with the uncertainty and all the trials and tribulations that come with what's happening in our world. But before we jump in, there's so many things we're going to talk about, Krista. I'd love to just invite us all to take some time to practice. We're all contemplatives here. So I'm just going to invite you all to just come to a comfortable seated or standing position. If you're seated, you can rest your hands on your lap. And if it's comfortable, bring your eyes to a gentle close, or you can place your gaze at a stationary point in front of you. And for the first few moments, just do a simple body scan. But begin with just noticing your breath. This breath entering your body and this breath leaving your body. Inhales and exhales. This simple act that really powers our life, our body battery. Just with awareness, inhale, exhale. If the mind drifts, that's okay. Notice what the mind is doing. Thinking, planning, anticipating, whatever it may be. And see if you can bring your attention now to your body. Beginning with the top of our head, our face, our eyeballs, our cheeks, and our chin. Just taking a moment to notice if there's any tension. And just making that invitation to relax and soften into your experience. Going further down to your neck, your shoulders, your torso. Just relax and soften to your arms, your hands, your belly. Relax and soften. Moving further down to your legs, your ankles, your feet. Relax and soften. Soften the tension that may be present. And just visualize the earth below us, really sucking that tension away from you. She's taking it and she'll compost it. But really releasing and relaxing in this home that you have, our bodies. Now bring your awareness back to your breath. And I'm going to ask you a few questions. I'm just going to request you to notice whatever arises. No need to go down the thinking loop. Just notice whatever arises. In one word, how do you feel about bias in our society today? In one word or phrase, how do you feel about bias in our society today? Just notice what arises. Any words that may come up. Then notice the affect attached to that word. Is it pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, somewhere on that spectrum? Notice the somatic experience of this word in your body. Where is it? Is it an expansion, contraction, tingling? Just bringing that sense of curiosity. No need to change, but just feeling into this intuitive wisdom, this response. Now that you've noticed it, let it go. Letting it go, returning your attention to your breath. Taking a few full breaths. Breathing in, breathing out. You may even want to open your mouth as you deeply inhale and exhale out of your mouth. Breathing in and exhale out of your mouth. Do that one more time. Deep inhale and exhale. Now, how would you feel in a world without bias? In a world where belonging replaces bias? In one word or a phrase. How would you feel in a world without bias, where belonging replaces bias? Once again, notice the word or phrase that arose for you. And then notice its affect. Is it pleasant, unpleasant, neutral? Then how does this word land in your body? What is its somatic experience? Just noticing it, feeling it, its comfort, discomfort, whatever it may be, just becoming an observer of your experience. And once again, letting that go. Breathing in, breathing out, returning to our oldest friend, this breath that's been with us since the very moment we came into this world. Really finding a sense of gratitude for this breath, its generosity to enable us to have this lived experience. And then after your next exhale, you can bring your chin to your chest, stretching the back of your neck. And if your eyes were closed, gently open them and let's return to our shared space together. All right. So I thought that was like a good way to start our conversation. And what I'd love to do for those of us we're an intimate group. If you want, please share what came up for you, what words came up for you, or phrases came up for you when you were asked how you feel about bias in our society today, and then how would you feel in a world without bias, where belonging replaces bias? It'd be interesting to see. And one thing I'd want to say is there's no right or wrong way to feel. So if you feel a certain way, that's cool. Those are your feelings and they're valid. So that's really, really important. And this is the invitation that begins the book, And for me, as we think about this present moment, Deborah shared overwhelmed to safe. That's in this moment, that's the journey of breaking bias, to move from this place of overwhelmed to safety. And that's the invitation for our breaking bias journey together. Yeah, Christa shared terrible to light and free, constriction to expansion. And one of the beautiful things about this exercise is that it's not just in the head. It's so important. The bias is actually emotional. Because if it was rational, if we could have solved it with logic, we would have done it already. We have so many smart people in our world. So that's why we have to really engage the body and the heart. And what I introduced, I don't know if you're familiar with this idea of feeling tone or emotional affect, but it's known as Vedana, right? It's basically the affect that is underneath our lived experiences. Michael Ray, hello. moving from biased to engaged, from tired to engaged. Wonderful. So, Christa, back to you.
Thanks for leading us in that exercise. I definitely made note when I was reading the book that in the very first paragraph, you pose this question, and there's an invitation to connect with one's emotional experience as well as the somatic and embodied experience of considering those questions. I think it's something unique about the approach that you're introducing and offering here, is the recognition that that bias is impacting us, like, as you said, beyond the conceptual or theoretical or thinking, that we're holding it, in our bodies. And so connecting with that part of us as we do the work seems to be one of the important pieces that you bring out. And so, yeah, I mean, thank you for that and allowing us to feel that. You also state that breaking bias is one of the most important, if not the most important work we can do in the 21st century. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I'll share my story a little bit before I go into that because they're a little connected. So to what you were just sharing, what happens with bias is that unless we notice it with mindfulness, unless we acknowledge it and feel it, it stays in our body. It stays repressed, and then it manifests as a whole set of challenges, right? Mental, emotional, psychological, physical, a lot of times, health problems. And for me, that's a lived experience, an embodied experience, because, even though I have all those things, all the labels that you read about me, professional labels, I'm also a, gay immigrant of color, right? Who moved to the country when I was 10 years old. And because of my physical appearance, I was oftentimes confused for, being a terrorist or, a whole lot of things, right? Particularly, and being queer, of course, complicated those things. And my response as a young person, as a teenager, was to basically shrivel, right? It was flight, never acknowledge it, but just like swallow. And my mind was very active. I'm a big nerd and studied quite a bit and was always after learning why there was so much cruelty in this world. Why is it that people were bullying me for no other reason than my being, right? I couldn't change my skin color or my sexuality. But that, when I came back, so I left the US after college and I lived abroad in several places. And I returned to the US for law school. And then being in a legal environment, which is a lot of it is about bias, right? Particularly the history of our country and our world, that didn't acknowledge it at all, and rather made me feel that what I was feeling was wrong. Going back to that aspect, that what I'm feeling is wrong. And that led me to, the ledge of my 18th floor window, about to jump off right before the second year, my second year started. But thankfully, this is the moment of grace. Instead of falling forward, I fell backwards into my apartment. And I share that story because that's kind of one of the egregious impacts of biases that we learn about ourselves. So it's not just bias that's happening that we do to others, but it's also what we do to ourselves. And this is a micro level experience because for me, the next day began my breaking bias journey, to begin to see and understand the stories, the lies I had been believing about myself, and then uncoupling them, piecing them together, which is what I share, in all of my work everywhere. But then this goes to the question of, well, all the challenges we face, the poly crisis, as it's often referred to, climate change, ecological destruction, political polarization, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, you name it, all the isms and phobias, war, at the root of it, it's because we are not believing certain people are worthy, right? We're believing in some sort of a hierarchy. some of the challenges, I'll take climate change because it's not the most obvious thing we think about when we think about bias. But a lot of the climate science and scientists, they're basically they've spent billions of dollars doing research to prove something that our indigenous communities have been saying for 400 years. Right. And indigenous people also have their ways of science, observation, noticing. But because it wasn't using a certain language of what's defined as science, it wasn't believed and often continues to be sidelined. So this is why bias is what controls a lot of these challenges. Why is it that there's still places in the world where women can't vote, they can't drive, and this is 2024. What is that story that we hold towards human beings purely because of their anatomy? And this is why, for me, I feel in order for us to really evolve human consciousness and to really liberate the human spirit that resides within all of us, breaking bias is the prerequisite.
Thanks for that. It called to mind, we had titled this session also like how contemplative practices can help us create more a sense of belonging, a world of belonging, right? Where people, no matter who they are, where they're from, or what their experiences are, or what their variety of identities are, they won't be made to feel as if they're less than, or that they shouldn't be taking up space, or that they shouldn't be, living into and sharing parts of who they are, with the world. And I think that is a really hopeful thing to move towards, that everyone belongs to each other. Actually, we belong to each other, and when people belong to one another, we listen and we care and we accept.
Exactly. And also we belong to ourselves, right? And I think for me, that was one of the most pivotal things I discovered is, unless we really heal the harms of bias that have been done to us, but also that we do to ourselves because we believe in certain lies, it's hard for us to have empathy for others because within ourselves, there's so much resentment that resides. So as we break these biases toward ourselves, we're also calling ourselves into, creating a beloved community within ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
And that's super important.
That's so important. Thank you for raising that. It actually segues into another question that I wanted to ask you, which is around the 4 types of bias. And of course, one of those types is internalized bias, which, as you described, can lead to feelings of either entitlement or victimhood. It can play out different ways, but related to what you were just saying about belonging to yourself. So I'm wondering if you could explain like the 4 different types of bias and how they could impact us.
Absolutely. So I'd like to begin with first defining bias itself. Well, what is bias, right? Because oftentimes there's a misconception that, oh my gosh, we're like born with bias. Nope. Biases are learned habits. So just as they're learned, they can be unlearned. And we learn these biases through 5 causes. And that's what most of my research has been about. We can count them on one hand, and that's how we learn biases, whether it's gender bias, racial bias, ethnic bias, disability bias, you name it. And their bias comes in 2 forms, conscious biases and unconscious biases. Conscious biases are learned false beliefs. And then unconscious biases are learned habits of thoughts. So these are associations. So when we, a lot of times the associations that we've been trained, the stereotypes that women are weak and men are strong, these baseless generalization, these are the associations that get, very easily triggered. And that's the training of our neural circuitry. So neuroscientists call it like neurons that fire together, wire together, right? So that's where kind of the big picture of what bias is. Now, bias manifests at 4 levels, like you said. The first is internalized bias. These are conscious and unconscious beliefs or habits of thoughts that we have toward ourselves because of our various secondary identities, because of the various labels we carry. One of the biases that a lot of people carry, particularly if they're parents, is being a mother or father, right? Internalize what these roles ought to be and the guilt that accompanies, particularly in the 21st century. Um, that's just one example, but there's so many other biases for me, like being a queer man, being of Indian origin, being an immigrant, so many, but those were internalized stories. Then there are interpersonal biases. So once we have these false stories that we believe in, we also project that onto others, in interpersonal spaces. So we are living in ideas of one another as opposed to being in the presence of who they are. So assuming with who they are before we even get to know them. That's challenging, right? And that's something we've all had an experience of. I don't care where we are on the identity spectrum, how much privilege or marginalized we feel. We've had that experience, for wearing glasses, for tying our hair a certain way. It's really interesting. And then we move to institutional and systemic biases. Now, this is really important because a lot of the disparities we see in our society based on various human identities is institutionalized and systematized. But when we think of institutions, we think of like sterile, empty buildings, right? But they're actually groups of human beings. Institutions are made up of people who share certain perceptions. And then those people and authority and influence that use those perceptions to design policies and make decisions. So that's where biases get institutionalized. So until the people that are making decisions break their internalized and interpersonal biases, they will continue to perpetuate those biases through those institutions. So whether it's a healthcare, like it's a hospital or a school, and then when institutions share certain, perceptions, biases, they become systemic. So hence we have challenges like mass incarceration. Hence we have challenges like school to prison pipeline or massive health disparities across the board. So that's why I think for me it's so important that for us to change the world, for us to really transform that, we have to start at the individual level as well. And I think for me, I really appreciated this fact because I was all about policy, which is why I went to law school. But when I worked in the courtroom and saw the types of disparities, sentencing disparities taking place in front of my eyes, I was like, wow, like the people that I'm working with, the judges, the prosecutors, they're all good meaning people. They don't wake up in the morning being like, oh, I want to be racist today, but they have those unconscious biases. So unless we help people shift hearts and minds and really break these biases, these disparities will perpetuate themselves and people will suffer for no other reason than their being. And this is where I feel like what we're doing together, contemplative practice, is essential to move the needle.
Yeah, very much so. So you, of course, introduce in your book what you call prism practices, which are included in each chapter, and it's kind of like a set of tools and skills. And mindfulness, as you say, is sort of the grounding for the rest of them. And so some folks joining us on the call, they might have their own contemplative practice, right? Maybe people are less familiar, but I think most tuning in are probably at least familiar with, the idea of a mindfulness practice, right? But
Yeah.
how would something like a mindfulness practice be used towards this end of ultimately breaking bias?
Yeah, that's basically, for me, like what I discovered through my own journey first is that just as bias is learned, it can be unlearned. And, when I first started my personal breaking bias journey, this was in 2009, I basically tested out a lot of interventions, loving kindness meditation, long meditation retreats, yoga, EMDR, a lot of the resources that I provide in the book as well. And I was just doing it for myself while also training to be a human rights lawyer. And then I started witnessing what was happening in the courtroom and the classrooms and looking at the neuroscience. They were actually testing these interventions to show a measurable reduction in bias. So for me, it's like, oh, well, how is it working? And basically what contemplative practices help us do is they help us slow down, which is really important for us to unlearn unskillful and unwholesome ways of being, and then replace those habits with new habits, more wholesome ways of being. And this is where the PRISM toolkit comes in. And PRISM is an acronym for 5 tools. And we really start at the level of M and we move ourselves up to P. And PRISM practices are actually not just in the head. It's not something just we do. It's something we experience somatically, something we feel at the emotional level. And it's a whole range of practices. We start with mindfulness, which is just noticing, awareness, how we started our time together. We became mindful of what was happening, of the words, of the somatic experiences. And we do that with stereotyping as it arises in our mind. And we don't suppress it. If judgment comes in, if shame comes in, like, oh my God, that was such a judgmental thought. Cool. Notice the judgment. Okay, now I'm judging. Shame, I'm embarrassed. Oh, I can't believe that I'm so transphobic. Okay, notice the embarrassment, notice the transphobic comment, whatever it is. But we're really kind of shining the light of awareness. And that's really important because what it does is allows us to begin to notice it and release our attachment and identification with what we've learned. And then we move to stereotype replacement, which is when we begin to notice stereotypes, we replace them with positive counterexamples, basically real life people that don't, that basically defy the stereotypes. So in the labs, they did it for Black men. People thought of Dr. King, but it doesn't have to be Dr. King. It could be anyone, right? Our best friend, our coworker, our child, who don't, who defy these stereotypes because stereotypes are generalizations. So what we're doing is, again, we're loosening that identification, that association to rewire our brains and create new habits of thoughts. And then we move to individuation, which is kind of a practice of curiosity and interest, where, if I'm with Christa, I'm with the full person Christa is versus my ideas of her, right? So if stereotypes arise, if associations arise, cool, that's great. We notice them. We can even talk about them, but don't get fixed, attached to them, right? That's the identification piece. And this allows us to really lean into, if you're a contemplative practitioner, to lean into the uniqueness of every human. And then we move to pro-social behavior tools, which are, if you're familiar with loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, joy, generosity, these are practices we cultivate. And at the neuroscience level, what it's doing is when we practice, loving kindness, for example, it's shifting that negative affect. It's shifting that fear, that hatred, that misconception at the emotional level. So it allows us to be more comfortable with difference, with not knowing, with uncertainty. And then, of course, finally moving to perspective taking, which is imagine what it's like to be in the shoes of another, right? So it's like radical. It's like breaking the boxes altogether. This is what really great actors do, right? They have often not lived the lives that they're portraying, but when we witness them, we're like, wow, because they've practiced perspective taking. And we can each do that. And it's not like a sequence, but you just start with M and go to P. No, it's very mixed, and it's very like all of these things are happening simultaneously, but we're really using all of our senses, visualization, our breath, our bodies, our hearts, and really taking our attention and gravitating it toward, this aspiration of breaking bias. And it takes anywhere from 3 to 8 weeks to build a practice. So that's the promise. Like if we build these practices 3 to 8 weeks, it just becomes a habit. And we see ourselves and one another as the unique beings that we are. So we can really be with ourselves and not ideas of one another.
Thanks. I think somewhere you had mentioned around like we're unlearning, and then we're relearning, and then we're unbecoming and becoming, right? So it's this process of addressing what's coming up within ourselves, awareness of this bias that we've absorbed, that we've unconsciously taken on, and just even becoming aware of that. And then, as you said, being able to develop a discerning but non-judgmental relationship with that, Because,
Hmm.
I think some people, we all have intersectional identities, right? Areas in our life where we're experiencing more or less power and belonging in a social space, a political space, an educational space,
Yeah.
whatever it might be. And so I think probably a lot of people could identify with an experience of shame, as you mentioned, that might come up when we realize we've made an assumption based on bias or stereotype, when we've, approached someone in a way that may have been offensive, not fully recognizing their fullness as a human being or their dignity in some way. And these experiences, if we're not approaching them also with compassion for ourselves, as well as recognizing the potential
Yeah.
harm, can really, I think, stop people or hang people up from continuing to even want to do this work
Yeah.
of breaking bias. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to the things that people can do in particular to help them deal with, the barriers that are there
Yeah.
for engaging in this work in a sustained way.
I think one of the biggest barriers, as you mentioned, is shame. It's these afflictive emotions. We have been trained to be like, okay, this is going to be a really tough conversation. I have to like prepare mentally, emotionally, physically to get into it. I'm ready to be called racist and sexist and all the things, right? And this is counterintuitive to who we are, right? Because ultimately, and this is why I think for me it was really important to discover, and I use the framework that the Dalai Lama really introduced me to, that we have a primary identity. Our first identity is that we're part of this, we're members of the same species, we're human beings, right? We're here to like really be of service to one another. And then all the labels we put on this body as humans, these are our secondary identity. So that's really important for us to, because what a lot of these labels do is they make us pit ourselves against one another. The us versus them, the me versus you. You're better, I'm worse, you're more privileged, I'm more marginalized. And it doesn't serve anyone because we stay stuck here. But ultimately, those experiences are true. They're correct, right? They can be valid. But we can also appreciate our common humanity and hold the absolute and the relative together. And I think for me, in order for us to do that, we have to really create a safe, shame-free, and trauma-informed learning container, which has been my invitation to do this work, because there is no them, there's just us, and there's just our earth, right? So unless we get into it and be in this human soup together, we're all screwed. Nature is showing us. um, and that's where I think it's really important. I think with that said, people have had traumatic experiences with bias, quite painful experiences with bias, which is why, if that's the case, I really invite people to start with loving kindness, with compassion practices for oneself. So don't worry about others yet. Let's start here, really, and tend to that pain and that grief. Because as we really attend to that, we could really then show up. And I know that's true because that's what I did. And I had, and once I was able to do that, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I can, like, I'm like, wow, other people are suffering too. And this is what I can offer. In the book, I basically bring in a lot of wisdom keepers, because a lot of the science around breaking bias is basically using, you know, the language and terminology and technology of modernity to repeat what wisdom keepers from all traditions have said in the past, whether they're Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or, Hindu. And there's one quote that comes to mind right now. It's from a Hindu saint, Swami Sri Yukteswar, and he said, "Forget the past. The past lives of all men are dark with many shames. Human conduct is ever unreliable until anchored in the sublime. Everything in the future will improve if you're making an effort now." And that's kind of really hopeful, right? Because oftentimes we get stuck in like this narrow thinking that, oh, we're all alone and we're the worst people. And that's the challenge of, being in a, being socialized in an environment that's deeply individual driven. So again, we bring that to mindfulness. We bring mindfulness to that too.
Thanks. That the piece you mentioned around this, the culture that's sort of this individual, driven, and people sort of get pit against each other, reminded me of the piece you had in the book around the comparing mind. And, it was so interesting because, you asked a question that was basically like, have you ever thought in your lifetime you were better or worse, right, than anyone else for any reason?
Yeah.
Like literally for any reason, like you're more talented as an artist or in your sport, or you have a higher education, or you dress better, or you're a kinder human being, like whatever it might be. Like, I don't know that any human being could answer no to that question, because I think we could probably all think of a time where our comparing mind did that. It's an active part of our mind often. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that and speak to that, and why you even mentioned that, and how that really relates to this idea of bias, and also maybe the approach that we need to take to unlearn that habit of mind.
Yeah. I would qualify what you said by just saying that I don't think any human being in the 21st century, versus in the past, because I learned about this. Actually, I was watching an old video from the Mind and Life Institute when, they were just founding, they were just beginning. And it was a conversation between neuroscientists and other scientists and Tibetan monks and the Dalai Lama and his entourage. And there was a scientist who asked that, she has a really difficult time, like, sending herself loving kindness. And at first, the Tibetans were confused. They were confused by this idea of self-loathing. They were like, what? You don't like yourself? How could that be? Because where they were coming from, their cosmology, their way of being wasn't surrounded by advertising that makes us feel bad about ourselves, that tells us day in and day out that we need certain products or services, or need to look a certain way to feel like we're worthy or we're good enough. So I think this is how, like, humanity, human societies have evolved. And comparing mind in that way is also learned, and the comparing mind is really about learning about hierarchies, a right way to be human all the time, right? Whereas, there's so many animist and indigenous cultures around the world where, some people may have more material things or may have more intellect, and it's not that there's more or less, but they're just good at math. But it's not something to be envious of. It's just, oh, that's their role and that's my role. And that's kind of it's like a mind-boggling kind of situation for many of us. We can't even imagine that, but it actually exists even right now in many corners of the world.
Thanks so much for that clarification, around, the habit, and perhaps in modernity, right, that we're learning that more. And, you mentioned media, and, it's great for selling things, you're not going to buy that next thing unless you're feeling crappy about yourself and you need to fix something. So there is a connection there, I think, with this, the way that our economies are operating in this day and age as well.
For sure.
And I think, there's also a chapter in the book on media, which I think relates to this subject matter, because it's around the narratives that are created and shared and repeated, and what those narratives are. And media includes a lot of things, of course, right? Our news cycles, whatever, movies, books, music. You could throw a lot of things in that category. you were commenting on media and the role that it plays in reinforcement, perhaps, of some of these hierarchies and some of this bias. And maybe there's ways, maybe you have suggestions or thoughts about how it might play a positive role. Since it is, at least in the United States, with our political cycle that we're having right now and elections,
Yeah,
all of this, would you comment on that a little bit about the media and its role in bias?
yeah. So one of the things that, through the process of researching that I discovered is, one of what we're attempting to do in terms of breaking bias is really shifting human consciousness from exclusion to inclusion, from separation to oneness, from hatred to compassion, from, othering and from dominating to being cooperative and being with one another. It's known as interbeing, Thich Nhat Hanh coined this term. And, the way media is one of the five causes of how we learn bias. And what media does is that a certain group of people are basically sharing their consciousness, whether it's rooted in fear or hatred, and really just blasting it and amplifying it using various platforms. Before the 20th century, those platforms were limited. They were theater pieces, they were maybe newspapers. Most people didn't know how to read, right? So, but I think in the 20th century and 21st centuries, we have so many more platforms for media makers to share their consciousness and really to infect us with fear, infect us with hatred, with separation. And that's what's happening in a lot of our political challenges, not just in the US, but especially in the US, but around the world. That's how division is being seeded. But it's the same cycle. Like propaganda was used, 100 years ago under the Nazi regime or the Soviet regimes or in China, right? And the Chinese Communist Party or Vietnam, you name it. It's basically, they just use different platforms because technology was where it was before. And that's what the church did, when they demonized women who played with animals or, and burned them at stake because they had an affinity for nature. So I think it's the same way. So I want people to think that, oh, this is what media is. And basically what it's doing is sharing that consciousness. And then the beautiful thing is that just as it shares these unwholesome ways of being, it can also share wholesome ways of being. And, for me, one example that comes to mind right away is Mr. Rogers, right? You're smiling just listening to his name, but he used his platform to bring people together, to train people in kindness. What he was doing was prism, literally, a different way of doing prism. And that's the opportunity. And, right now, because there are some mega platforms out there, with channels out there that are using media to continue to seed hatred and separation, we can become mindful of that and choose to turn it off and then actually seek media that brings us together. For me, like that's how I did a lot of my unwiring, is to learn about cultures and peoples and communities using media that was hopeful, that was optimistic, that was, building bridges. And it takes a few of us at first, right? And there are many, many people that are doing that to then begin to tip the scale. But if you're a media maker, it's so important to, take responsibility and ownership and break your biases. So you use your platforms to really bring people together to elevate human consciousness.
Thanks. Yeah, that seems to be an ongoing issue, right? Like I'm
Yeah,
always searching for, media that I feel is presenting information and I guess their consciousness that's looking for positive solutions and the ways that we can be in deeper conversation and relationship with
yeah,
each other versus doing things that are seemingly, their goal would be maybe to separate or, get views or get money or whatever the other, alternative things are that
yeah,
are happening there. Um,
exactly.
But, what I heard you saying is that in a way, we share in that when we're consuming certain types of media and we're sharing that media, and maybe even when we're discussing it. And so for us to become aware of our
Yeah,
role that we're playing there,
yeah,
it's really important.
absolutely. And for us to see that, you know, I really love Thich Nhat Hanh, and he's been one of my root teachers. And he talks about, food isn't the only thing that nourishes our bodies and souls, right? Everything we take in through our sense of sight, our smell, our, what we listen to, the environments we're in, these are all a form of food that nourishes how we perceive ourselves and others, who we be. So that's where kind of mindfulness of, oh, this is a lot of negativity. I'm not going to consume that, right? And just like that, by just noticing and labeling it negativity, you're like, okay, turn it off. But if we just kind of sit there as a couch potato and just like, oh, this is making me uncomfortable, it's making me anxious, my jaw is clenching. But we're still kind of not fully aware that, oh, this is what's happening to us, and this may be causing us harm. So we become kind of our own advocate in that way.
Which I guess would apply to our internal dialogue as well, right? If we're hearing it and it's just junk, to recognize it.
Yeah. I
Turn that off.
I I call it delusion. I'm like, oh, there's delusion again, telling me I'm not good enough, I'm unworthy. Okay, hi, delusion.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of those ancient practices, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you might have any advice for people who are working in the space of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. Maybe they're working in the space of um, human rights or social justice issues in their community. Every day is faced with the inequities, the policies they're trying to change. It's hard work. And, our program that I run here, the Contemplative Based Resilience Project, we work with folks who are engaged in those fields. And, people can feel isolated, they can feel discouraged, they can feel stretched in terms of the empathy that they're feeling and the fatigue that might come from that. Of course, compassion practices is one of the practices that we introduce to help with that. I'm just wondering if you might have advice or suggestions, maybe related to those prism skills or anything else that you feel would really help people who are quite actively working on this.
Yeah, I think compassion practices are definitely great. I would complement a lot of the prism tools with, there's three reasons. I feel like the breaking bias journey has three components. Prism is really about helping us rewire and correct misinformation. Um, Prism is really about cultivation of empathy and all these positive emotions. But what we also need to do is correct misinformation and bridge the information gaps. So I've been that person who's been completely burnt out, and I still am that person sometimes because, I get so identified with this idea of justice and equality. Um, and I think for me in those moments, it's really important to acknowledge where I am historically and placing myself in that. Because oftentimes we get deluded by the values that we aspire, that everyone ought to be equal, but we forget the history, right? And I am very guilty of shoulding reality, that it shouldn't be this way. It shouldn't be this way, right? They shouldn't do this, right? And that's cool, right? It's basically a call for help. Um, but it is. It is this way. And I think about a lot of my mentors and people I look up to, the civil rights and human rights advocates, they did that work of not shooting reality. Of course, they're aspiring to create a better world, but they're like, oh, this is how things are. And they understand the causes and conditions that have created this world, right? And once we kind of see the causes and conditions, which is so helpful from a contemplative perspective, right? What we're seeing are consequences of those causes and conditions. And then we can kind of move to those root causes and begin to transform those causes to create, different consequences. So that's kind of, in the Buddhist tradition, there are two wings to the Dharma: compassion and understanding, or wisdom. So that's the wisdom portion that's really, really important. And I think it's really important for human rights workers and people that are working in social justice, because, for me, it's been really hard, pill to swallow. Of course, queer people should be equal. Of course they should be. They should be able to love whomever they want to love. But it's been less than 10 years since the right to marry has been around, in our over almost 250 years of history. So I think that's where perspective is really helpful. And that's what's known as wise understanding. And the compassion piece is really important because regardless of what happens in the external world, it doesn't shake us internally. So I think of Nelson Mandela, right? He was in, solitary confinement for, I think, 27 years. Of course, it was probably really difficult, but he never regretted a moment being there because it helped him unwire and kind of find his center. So a lot of these kind of bigger, people that we really, really admire, they're just like us, but they kind of, as contemplatives, they built that inner strength. And that's what we see in every successful social movement. People have that inner sense of knowing, so they don't get pulled by the trials and tribulations, the worldly winds, as it's known as the Buddhist tradition.
Thanks. I think that relates to what you had mentioned earlier around creating a practice. And then that takes time, but it's something that we're committed to in an ongoing way, that is going to be, it helps us. But it's not something that we just decide one day, like, oh, I'm gonna, even things like, I'm gonna be more loving today, like, okay, and then something happens that's very difficult for us to feel that emotion or to enact that behavior that we said we wanted to do, right? So this idea of creating the practice is so important if we're serious about the journey that we're on. And so I'm wondering if you might have any advice for people around practicing these skills and these mindsets.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I think meditation is so important. For me, I do it now, it's like twice a day, morning and evening. It's just basically my respite away from the world to just really cultivate that bodhicitta, that inner sense of knowing that I have. But you don't have to do that. It could be literally, let's start with 1 minute in the morning, 30 seconds, if that's what you can do, but just observing our breath and kind of taking a break from all that external stimulus. But meditation is just one form, right? It's one vehicle. While we're doing the dishes, while we're walking, we're doing the laundry, while we're with other people, little things, right? Like if we're going to leave our apartment or home, noticing just turning of the knob, opening the door, walking practice. When we're walking, we're really with walking, noticing that our mind isn't going anywhere. Really, I learned this practice from Thich Nhat Hanh once again. It's like noticing that my feet are kissing the ground with every step. Again, so we're cultivating those positive emotions. When we're driving or we're commuting, just sending ourselves and others well wishes. We think of someone who is, struggling, instead of, my response to initially is like, oh my God, I wish I could do something. But I'm like, oh no, I can actually be like, oh, may you be happy. May you sort it out, right? Can be like blessed. And these are just little ways that we can really make these practices more palpable. So that's kind of at the individual level. The interpersonal level is just as important, which is let's talk about it. Let's talk about prism. Let's make compassion and joy sexy. We talk about all the other things. Let's gossip about compassion. Let's make this mainstream, at least in the communities and our families that we are in touch with. Because if you're here, um, you care about this stuff, right? So, and oftentimes loneliness comes when we're unable to be our full selves. And if it feels difficult, because I know it did for me for a very long, I couldn't talk about the most important thing to me, which is, these Prism contemplative practices with many of my family members and friends. So then I found communities where it was cool to do that, right? Going to New York Insight or IMS and other places. And, so it's really about building that community. And Garrison Institute, I've been on so many retreats there. So I think these possibilities are there. And yeah. Do you have any ideas in addition, Christa? I mean, you've been in the throes of this for so long too.
Thanks. I mean, I want to highlight what you just said about community. And it does take, sometimes it feels risky, or there's vulnerability involved in even bringing the topic up or
Yeah.
reaching out to have a conversation. At the Garrison Institute, we're actually using this conversation we're having right now to have a facilitated dialogue at one of our later meetings, as a way of bringing up the topic and discussing it maybe with some people that we haven't talked to about it yet, So I think the idea of, bringing it to a colleague or your workplace or a community group or your church or your spiritual group or wherever you might be, to say, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing this might be an issue that impacts a lot of us. And,
Yeah.
it may even be something that is keeping us from one another, is something between us in a way that's harming us in our relationship. And so I'm wondering if we could talk about it, just be able to listen to people's experiences and invite things like feelings into the conversation and not
Yeah.
be afraid of that, and invite things like how does that, where are you feeling that in your body, to really recognize this isn't an intellectual exercise. This isn't something we're talking about so we can find the best word for XYZ, right?
Yeah.
It's about our experience. And so I think reaching out to others is really important, even though it can be scary at times.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I think it's so important. Thank you for sharing that. And, little things, mindful minutes with colleagues. I also like the exercise of compassion bombing. Like
Mm.
before I go into a meeting, I just like, basically share certain positive well wishes with everyone I'm about to meet. It
Mhm.
just helps me ease my own anxiety oftentimes, but also makes me feel closer to the people I'll be meeting with. So like little
Yeah.
tactical things we can do.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, remaining in a space of curiosity, you
Mhm.
feel like you know someone, but there's so many things you don't know,
Yeah.
assuming that you don't know probably more than you do know. And that can sort of bring in some ease or relaxation into that interaction when you're not jumping to conclusions about who they
Yeah.
are, why they're saying what they're saying. Um, so yeah, I think that mindful listening is such an important piece. And I know it can feel and be challenging at times when we're having internal reactions, or we feel perhaps activated or triggered by something someone said, and it feels in a way, maybe threatening to ourselves, our identity, or our sense of safety.
Yeah.
So you mentioned safety earlier, and I do think that is often people are not feeling the safety that would be useful to them in those moments.
Yeah. And for me, that's where the shared agreements really are so important. There's 5 shared agreements that I recommend everyone follow, using I statements, commitment to dialogue, which is those 2 wings of understanding and compassion. Staying present, so noticing what's arising and investigating discomfort, not shying away from it. And then of course, privacy and confidentiality. So I think once we kind of have these agreements in place, communicate them, we can build that trust and we can kind of be in the discomfort with each other in order to get out of it, right? Because we are social animals. We regulate emotionally with each other as well. So it's actually a good thing that discomfort comes up because people are our teachers to move through it. But we need some, safety, assurance of safety, which is what these agreements can really help us do.
Thanks for that. So I'm wondering if anyone who's joining us now has a question they would like to pose or ask or a comment. If you have a burning question you'd like us to address or want to pose to Anu before we close, I wanted to just create space for it now. So we'll take a pause in case anyone does. Thank you. Yeah. Can I say I'm also hearing a little bit of frustration with that, with the timetable, right? And I think like this is something that's very common and also a place where we can apply the practice to ourselves. Because that sort of the frustration or the impatience, right? Totally natural, completely normal. And also a great place to apply the practices to ourselves to help us work. I'm noticing there's one more question in chat. I wonder if we could address that just before we close as well. Do you see it there, Anu? Would you like me to read it?
Yeah, no, I can read it.
Okay.
Is the pushback on the conversation about bias or DEI negatively impacting the work, or is it reinforcing the need for practices that break bias? How has doing this work transformed you and your relationships? So it's interesting. I think it is negatively impacting the work in form of resources. I think a lot of people that have been doing this work feel under-resourced and underinvested in. But with that said, the work continues, right? This is, for me, the most important work we'll be doing this century, as we are at the precipice of artificial intelligence basically taking over different aspects of our life. These biases are getting encoded in these algorithms. So for us, it's really, really important that we really pay attention to this, and this work will only get more and more important. And for me, this is why it's really important. I talk a lot about this in the book as well, is to begin to notice the currencies that are important to us. Before the advent of modern day neoliberal capitalism, money wasn't the only currency around which our families and communities were centered around. There were other currencies: kinship, love, compassion, spiritual commitments, right? And I think it's time that a lot of us, and I think for me, justice, right, equity, for so many of my ancestors and our ancestors, civil rights leaders, women's rights leaders, they weren't out there to get a paycheck. This was about human liberation. What's freedom, right? And that's what we're really kind of wanting to return to, which is the second part of your question, that this is just the pendulum swinging left, back and forth politically. But the work still continues, and there are hundreds of thousands, now millions of people around the world that are doing this, outside of what we see in the media, outside of what we see and hear about on a day-to-day basis. And for me, like, how has this work transformed me? I mean, it's made me more human. It's humbled me. It's brought me to my knees. It's been some of the biggest, it's been the biggest gift to really feel the gift of life in this way. So yeah, thank you for that question. I'm getting a little emotional, but it's, I wouldn't be doing anything else with my life, with my time.
I love that question too. So thank you so much to everyone who's joined us today for this incredibly enriching conversation, and everyone who will be viewing the video recording as well. I want to encourage you all to continue the conversation and also the personal inquiry around this work. There's a lot to be gained, as Anu said here, in doing this work with one another. And so I also want to thank Anu for this conversation, for your wisdom, for the incredible amount of, personal investment and professional work that you've put into this. I found the information that is in your book that's coming out very shortly very, very clear, and also very invitational, and very welcoming. Like I felt included when I was reading the book and the material in there. And I think that's a great way to enter into, a deeper part of this work together. Yeah, we're at our time now, so I have to close, but it's just until next time and not really goodbye. And I'll also invite everyone to check out, our additional offerings, garrisoninstitute.org. And I know Anu has additional offerings as well, and we can post some of those links in chat. So you can check those out. We'll also repost that information when we put this video on our YouTube channel so that all the information will be there for you as well. I feel like the work that we're engaged in is extremely synergistic and related. And so we can continue to support one another in this work. And so if you're interested in, making a donation, you can also do that on our website. Also, please donate it to any other organizations that are doing incredible work in this area that you feel moved to support, So yeah, I just want to thank you all for being with us today. Anu, thank you so much again, and hope we meet again soon.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Christa and Elizabeth, and everyone who came today. And yeah, please stay in touch. You can find me everywhere. And so it's a good way. We're in this together. We're really building a beloved community. That's our North Star. And have a beautiful evening ahead.
Take care, everyone. Be well.
Bye.
Goodbye.